All right, living environment fans, you're back on a Wednesday here at Peru Central School. And yeah, we've been talking all about natural selection and Darwin and the peppered moths and, of course, the finches are what we're going to concentrate on as we work today. And, of course, the big question is going to be with Darwin was, could natural selection make new species? And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't go over what it means to be a species, and we'll talk a little bit about that today in my Bellringer. Of course, you'll have an Ed puzzle lesson to do, some notes to do in class, and then if you have lab today, you'll start the Beaks of the Finches lab. So that's something to look forward to over the next few days. All right.
All right.
Hey now.
Mr. Kovacs class. It's Mr. Kovacs class. You might learn a ton. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
He's interested too.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
And he's super cool.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
How do we define a species? Simply, it's a kind of thing, right? Like dogs are a kind of thing. Right? They're just dogs. Even though they might look different dogs, they're still dogs, right? It's a kind of thing. Of course, we know that through selective breeding, we've made different versions of the same kind of thing. Why are they the same species? Well, the same species because they can reproduce. And that's the key definition for a species. It's like the kind of thing. And it's separate from another kind of thing because of a reproductive barrier. Species, right? These dachshunds are all the same species, right? Same kind of thing. Same kind of thing. Species. These people here are the same kind of thing. There's lots of variety, right? Variety in a species, but that still makes us the same kind of thing. Right? Now, reproduction is kind of tricky because we have what's called hybridization. Like, you may know this, but horses and donkeys are separate species, but when they mate, they have viable offspring, right? We call that a mule. But since a mule has an odd number of chromosomes, it can't actually reproduce on its own. So that's what keeps horses and donkeys separate species. So you can obviously say, well, horses and donkeys are separate species, but they're pretty closely related if they can have babies together, even though their babies can't have babies. All right, so we kind of define a species as, well, that's loading pretty slowly. Define a species as, two organisms that can get together, have babies, and their babies can also have babies. Weird. Right, now, species can look alike, right? Or there can be great phenotypic variation. It depends. But what makes them a species is they can mate, right? So the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark, although they look very different, do not mate with each other. They are different species. The two different phenotypes of the gaudy commodore moth can mate together and have viable offspring. So they're the same species, right? It all has to do with species have the same genes and gene compatibility, and their genes can intertwine. So even though DNA is all made out of the same stuff, gametes can't always get together and make viable offspring unless you have the right matches of DNA and the right matches of genes and those kinds of things. Of course, Darwin said that to make a new species, you have to start with an original species. He said they have to be separated by some barrier, either geographic or temporal or something, some barrier. And then on either side of the barrier, conditions had to be different. The environment had to be different. And then those two groups will change directionally into two different species, although different, now no longer reproducing with each other, still kind of look quite a bit alike. That was Darwin's thing. There's some interesting things about that. We see this a lot, like we call it the founder effect, when just a few members of a population move to a new place. All you get that moves to that new place are those genes. You don't get any of those. So this example, on this island, you've got white, orange, and black moths. If only black and orange moths move to the new island, you're probably not gonna have any white moths there. Not because they can't live there, but because their genes aren't coming with them, right? Selection. We also have this weird thing that happens to populations where if something kind of random happens and kills a lot of members, it could throw off the gene allele frequencies, right? So you can have kind of even alleles in the same population, and then a disaster hits, and now your alleles are different. That's not due to selection, that's just random, right? Or what we sometimes call the population bottleneck, which is where only a few members of that population survive. Whoever survives, they're the only ones that can pass genes on, right? So you might lose genes from a population that way. Natural selection. Good example of two really closely related species that are separate species, and they are geographically separated by the Congo River, right? We have the bonobos and the chimpanzees, and the bonobos are totally geographically separated. So they've evolved to a separate species because they have just slightly different selective pressures than their brethren, the chimpanzees, right? So that's why chimpanzees and bonobos are separate species. Hopefully all of this makes sense. Species have the same genes. They might have different alleles of those genes, but the same genes, and they can reproduce together. And so our official biology definition of a species is two organisms that can reproduce and produce viable offspring. Okay? Even if they don't choose to reproduce, if they could, they're still the same species. It's all about whether or not they can. And again, when natural selection creates new species, according to Darwin anyway, the two new species will look very similar to each other. They'll only be slightly different. And they won't actually be considered separate species until they reach that reproductive barrier point. And so he'd explained all of the tree of life on Earth is a result of natural selection slowly separating species so that they can't reproduce, and then separating those branches so they can't reproduce, and so on and so forth. That's Darwin, right?